As I'm starting this new series of sharing recipes from grandmothers, I can't help but think of my own grandmother. Growing up in Belarus, I only had one grandmother. My dad's parents died young, so he ended up was being raised in an orphanage. My mom's dad died when I was young, so I have no recollection of him except from, looking through the pictures. So my grandmother holds a very, very special place in my heart. She didn't live in a fancy house. In fact, she didn't even have a bathroom. She had an outhouse that we all used. Also, all the water was brought back from the well. She didn't have like a running water. Yet her modest house was so comfortable, was so warm and welcoming, and the smell of delicious food still lingers when I close my eyes to this day. And perhaps that's why these apple fritters with apple cider glaze remind me so much of her. These apple fritters bring comfort and warmth not only to your belly, but to your soul. I've been making these fritters for years now. In fact, my family knows that every fall they will have these fritters. It's not something I make often, but when I do, they get gone in minutes. Even my husband says that he will share any dessert I make with neighbors except for these apple fritters. Now, you may wonder what makes these fritters so special. Well, let me tell you. One, I use fresh Granny Smith apples. A lot of time, big production facilities like big bakeries or stores, they use canned apples because nobody has time to peel and cut a million apples. But what makes these fritters the best of the best is the apple cider glaze. I start out with 2 cups of apple cider and I cook it down and reduce it to 2 tablespoons. So the flavor is so concentrated that when you add powdered sugar and a little bit of heavy whipping cream, the flavor profile of the glaze and the taste of apple cider is unmatched. What I also love about this recipe is some of the things I can make ahead. So for example, I can make my apple cider reduction the day before. I can also cut up the apples and cook them the day before. So when I'm actually baking these fritters or cooking these fritters, all I have to make is the dough, let it rise, and then assemble it, cook it, and have the glaze prepared while my dough is rising. Usually when I start to shape the fritters, the kids start coming one by one asking when the fritters will be ready. I believe it's because of all the cinnamon that they can smell, and I was cooking this particular batch on a cooler day. It was already cool outside, so it just felt so cozy inside. The smell of cinnamon, it just smelled like fall. So they're just one by one were drawn by that smell in the kitchen, coming and asking when can they have the first fritter. Once they heard that frying sizzle, they all lined up waiting for the fritters to be finished cooking. The kids didn't even wait for me to glaze the fritters. They would come one by one, get the fritter, dip in a sauce, and off they go again until a few minutes later they would come back in and get a few more, and off they go to play outside. If you love fritters, this is definitely a recipe you have to try for yourself. By trade, my grandmother was a doctor. She was an endocrinologist. After Chernobyl, she traveled around the country a lot, checking up on children, because one of the side effects of Chernobyl and release of the radiation is thyroid cancer. In fact, I still remember during my birthday parties, all the children would line up and one by one she would touch our throat, checking for the thyroids to see if they feel normal. My grandmother was a very respected doctor in her field. During USSR times, doctor was not a financially rewarding profession, and what I loved about my grandmother, that was not her incentive. She loved taking care of other people. And so with that, she lived a very modest lifestyle, very frugal, and perhaps I would like to think that some of those genes I inherited from her. Perhaps that's why this apple cake recipe reminds me of my grandmother. It is simple yet so delicious. It's moist, it's full of flavor, and it's one of those cakes that when you want something quick and easy to make, this is the recipe that you want to have on hand. Trying to be resourceful like my grandmother, I pulled this bacon pan from our local trash dump not long ago. It was inside the box. Somebody just threw a lot of their kitchen items. So when I saw it, I was so excited to just bring it home and try to bake apple cake. I washed it really good and wanted to see if my cakes will come out looking as beautiful as this pan looks. I overfilled this pan with batter just a little bit. So after my cake was done baking, it had that crispy edges around it. But my family thought it was fantastic. They all enjoyed eating that crispy edges around the cake. I usually bake this cake in a just regular loaf pans, so I wasn't sure what to expect when the cake finally came out. To fancy them up, I decided to add a little bit of powdered sugar, and I loved the final result. My kids said that it looked like a little pine cone. And in case you're wondering why I have 4 cakes and not 6, and it is because my kids and husband decided to sample them before I even had a chance to do a video of them. To stretch her dollar, my grandmother always had a garden. She grew her own potatoes, she had fruit trees, fruit bushes, she grew vegetables. And she was the type of woman who could make something out of nothing and it would taste delicious. There was no waste with my grandmother. This apple bread pudding feels like a good reflection of my grandmother. It is simple, humble, yet deeply comforting, much like the way she lived her life. The ingredients for this recipe are very simple. We have bread, the older the better. Then we have apples that are drizzled in this caramel brown sugar syrup. This is the kind of recipe that you can assemble the night before and then bake it in the morning when it's nice, cool, crisp fall morning. And I promise you, you will have zero regrets. Even if you add ice cream to your bread pudding for breakfast, there will be zero judgment from me. Bread pudding has one of those stories that feels as comforting as the dish itself. It began all the way back in medieval Europe around the 11th and 12th centuries. People didn't waste a crumb of bread in those days. Instead, stale loaves were softened with milk, eggs, and maybe a little fat, then baked into something warm and filling. It was often called poor man's pudding because it turned scraps into something nourishing. As time went on, every culture made it their own dish. So, for example, in England, bread pudding was enriched with cream, sugar, and dried fruit. While in France, they literally called it lost bread, the same phrase that gave us French toast. In Spain and Latin America, it became known as something dressed with caramel or citrus. And here in American South, New Orleans made it famous with bourbon sauce and rum-soaked raisins. Another group of people who loved bread pudding was sailors. When they would go on long trips back in the day, bread didn't have all the preservatives that we have today, so the bread would go stale very quickly. So in order to revive the bread, they would add milk, sometimes egg, and a little bit of rum to add the flavor and bake it, which then came about the bread pudding for them. Another story took place in the 18th century Spain, where a monastery often relied on donations of leftover bread to feed their communities. The nuns would take those bread scraps, soften them with milk and eggs, and bake them into bread pudding. Sometimes they poured caramelized sugar over the top, and that simple act turned a humble dish into something beloved. As Spanish missionaries traveled to the New World, the recipe traveled with them, spreading through Latin America, gaining popularity and becoming a taste and comfort tied to faith, simplicity, and the idea that nothing good should ever go to waste. This dish carries a very rich history. We have sailors at sea, we had nuns in kitchens, we have families in medieval homes. They're all looking for comfort and humble ingredients. And I feel like this recipe also carries my grandmother's stories. She may not have lived with wealth, but like bread pudding, her life was rich in service, warmth, and quiet strength. And that's something that I admire so much about her. Sitting at a table with my kids sharing this bread pudding, I told them about their great grandmother, how she served others with quiet dignity. They never knew her, but through dishes like this, I hope they can taste a little of who she was. And in a simple recipe like this, her story lives on.